Hi weaving friends, I'm here today to chat with you a little bit about what a rigid heddle really is. This video is sponsored by the online weaving school where you will find classes in rigid heddle, table, floor and Inkle loom weaving. Classes are available for single purchase, or you may want to dive into a membership where you get access to the wonderful members group and a full library of online weaving classes. There are also free classes available. All you have to do is register an account and I'll leave the link for that down below. Join over 7,000 students and see what the online weaving school is all about. I would love to see you there. Well, this is a rigid heddle I've got right here in front of me. Sometimes you'll see these called heddles and sometimes you'll see them called reeds, and they're actually a combination of both. This is really a very unique piece of equipment for weaving. In more traditional weaving, say for example on my floor loom, the heddles are made of string or textile or metal, and they are movable, and every single thread has its own heddle. But a rigid heddle is basically just what it sounds like. The heddles, or the spaces through which the threads go, are rigid. They don't move. Most of the time your heddle will be made of plastic and wood. Sometimes they'll be made entirely of wood, and a lot of people are actually 3D printing their own rigid heddles these days, which is pretty darn cool. So this video was prompted by a student question. I thought it was a pretty good question. She said, what is a dent? Well, when we're referring to rigid heddles, we talk about the dents. Dent you can think of as basically a space through which your thread can go. If you look up to the top of your own rigid heddle, most of the time, depending on the company, there will be some numbers at the top. This one says 7.5, and that tells me that it's a 7.5 dent heddle. But what does that actually mean in the real world? Well, it means that if you use this particular heddle, you can achieve 7.5 ends per inch. And see, this is the difference between a rigid heddle and a different kind of loom, is that the set, or the ends per inch, are already set in place by the size of your heddle. So you choose a heddle that suits the type of yarn or the size of the yarn that you want to use at any time. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but let's get to the measuring first. Now I mentioned that this is a 7.5 dent heddle. So that's going to help us, that information that we've got, in understanding how that figure came to be in the first place. Now I already said to you that if you use this heddle, it's set at 7.5 ends per inch. So looking at my tape measure, over about an inch, I'm going to count every single space through which a thread can go on this heddle. I'm counting, of course, the holes, because we always use the holes and the slots on the rigid heddle for a regular plain weave anyway. So my first hole is right here, so I'm going to count that as number 1. Next one is a slot, that's number 2. Then a hole, number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then I'm almost at my inch mark, but this is a 7.5 dent heddle. So I can't count this slot fully as a number 8, I'm going to count it as a half. So you see that over that inch measurement, we get 7.5 spaces or ends per inch where we can put threads through. So what if I have a different size heddle? Okay, this time I brought in my 10 dent heddle. And you can already see the spaces are much closer together compared with, let's compare it with the 7.5. Yeah, easy to see that this one looks quite gappy and this one, they're much closer together. So I know that if I'm going to use my 10 dent heddle, well, this gives me a clue already that I'm not going to be able to use a really thick yarn in this heddle. I'm going to use a thinner yarn that I would use in my 7.5 dent. So that's one clue already. But let's measure it. So I'm lining up my tape measure again, and I'm going to go over an inch, starting with the first hole. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there on my inch, if I just push my tape measure across a little because I wasn't quite lined up with the edge, over that inch space, that measures exactly 10 spaces or 10 dents. So that is my 10 dents per inch. So how does this information relate to actually translating this information to use it on the loom? Well, it's extremely important that we match the right yarns to the right heddles. So let's say hypothetically I wanted to do a balanced weave on my 7.5 dent heddle that I've got right here. First thing you need to do is to do your set test. Now if you're not familiar with set, or you're not sure how to figure out the set for your particular yarn, I'm going to link to 2 videos down below. The first one explains what set is, and the second one explains how to determine the set of any given yarn. Now, once you can do this, you have such freedom, and something will click in your brain and you'll suddenly understand how they relate to the dents in your heddle. So please do go and watch those 2 videos first if you are pretty clueless about set. It's not hard to figure out. And as I always say, you do not have to understand exactly what you're doing, just follow the actions to get the results, and the understanding can come later. So what I can figure out from my set test is, once I've done my set test with this particular yarn on my inch ruler, I found that it has roughly 15 wraps per inch. So if you're familiar with the set and the wraps per inch, once you've determined your wraps per inch, you divide that in half for a balanced plain weave. And so if I divide 15.5, guess what I get? 7.5. That way I know that if I want to do a plain weave on my rigid heddle loom, this 7.5 dent heddle is almost perfectly matched to this particular yarn. Now, many of you, if you have a rigid heddle loom from a different company other than Ashford, you may have an 8 dent heddle that came with your loom. So when you have a heddle that doesn't exactly match the set that you've determined for your yarn, then you can start making little decisions. And the decision's usually based on the project itself, how you want it to turn out. So let's say that I was, again, using this yarn as an example, 15 wraps per inch, divided in half is 7.5. And I was like, oh no, I don't have a 7.5 dent heddle, I've only got an 8 dent heddle. Well, once you've had enough experience using all different size heddles and all different yarns, you can then make decisions like, well, the 7.5 ends per inch is very, very close to the 8, and so I'm just going to use this in the 8 and I'm sure it'll be fine. If you have a larger discrepancy, let's say you had a yarn and you found that it was 18 ends per inch. Okay, I don't have a yarn to give as an example for that, but just hypothetically, 18 ends per inch. Now if I divide that in half for a balanced plain weave, I get 9. There is no company that makes a 9 dent rigid heddle, but that's okay because we can accommodate. So I would be thinking about the project and whether I want it to be lighter in area and softer, or whether I wanted it to be a little bit firmer, and then I'd make my decision from there. Now, if I had a yarn, like I've just given in that example, more likely than not, I would move up to a 10 dent heddle rather than stay down at my 7.5. For that 9 ends per inch, it's more reasonable to me to go up to the 10 dent. However, if I wanted a really light scarf, and I didn't mind if it was a bit gappy, you know what I mean by a bit gappy, like the threads are a little bit more open, then I would go, hey, I think that's going to be perfect in my 7.5 dent heddle. So these decisions become easier over time and experience with all different yarns, different types of projects. And of course, if you are really unsure if you have a particular yarn with a particular project in mind and your figures aren't adding up well enough for you, you can always shoot me an email or a message and I'll do my best to help out. So going back to my 10 dent heddle now, which yarn would I be using for this? Well, this yarn right here is a fingering weight yarn, and when I do my set test with it, I get 20 wraps per inch. Divide that in half. For a balanced plain weave, that gives me 10 ends per inch. So I know that this particular fingering weight wool is perfect for this 10 dent heddle. So for certain yarns, once you've used them once or twice and you like the results, that it takes a bit of thinking out of the equation, because you will just remember that, oh, that particular yarn, this one happens to be Bendigo Woolen Mills Luxury 4-ply, which is a beautiful Australian merino yarn. I've used this so extensively since I began weaving. Don't even ask me how many balls of this I have been through, but I know this yarn very well and I know the results that I'm going to get with it in my 10 dent heddle. And you will come to know these kinds of things as well. There are a couple of other things that I want to point out about your rigid heddle. When you have a look at the information at the top where it says about our 7.5 dents per inch, you'll notice that at least on an Ashford there's also this other information that says 30/10. This is metric information rather than the imperial that appears here. And it just means that over 10 centimeters that you will get 30 threads in that 10 centimeters. So it's just another type of measurement. And then if you look in between where it says Ashford and the 7.5, you'll see a dot. That dot means that directly underneath, this is the very middle of your rigid heddle. This is really handy information. And you can see on mine that I always keep a piece of waste yarn tied in the middle. Sometimes it depends what I'm doing, but on my finer heddles, I might also tie waste yarn on every 10 slots or something like that, just to help me quickly calculate things. And then I often also tie waste yarn. I'll measure out my project. So let's say I was doing a scarf and I wanted it to be 10 inches width actually on the loom once I'd done all my calculations. Then I could just come to the middle, put my 5 in the middle, and then measure along and put a marker here and a marker at the 10 inches over here as a quick thing. You don't have to continually be counting if you miss your place. That's just a quick and easy tip. The last thing I want to go over with you is just the care of your rigid heddles so that you give these a really long life. These are not cheap to buy, and especially if you want to have a lot of sizes, if you're getting into weaving with 2 and 3 heddles and that kind of thing, then just some basic care will help prolong the life of these heddles. So the first thing is to not have it in a place that is damp. Doing that will probably warp your wood over time and may render this unusable. Another thing is to not have it in a place that is too hot. We are dealing with plastic here, so if it gets too hot or it gets near a source of heat too much, these can melt and warp as well. And the third thing is to go easy on your heddle and don't be rough on it when you're threading. Now I know this sounds a little bit silly, but here I've got my 15 dent heddle and we'll compare it to the 7.5 and you can see just how much incredibly bigger this one is. Well, the 7.5 is ever so much stronger, so it's really easy to thread and you don't have many worries with that one. But with the 15 dent, if you look at these heddles carefully, they actually move if I just press them from the back. So when I'm continually putting my hook through to thread, I don't want to be kind of putting my hook from side to side and moving those heddles about. I just want to take a little bit of extra time to make sure I'm going vertically and carefully, and never use a yarn that's too big for these holes and slots. These are really for finer threads. So the basic moral of the story is treat your rigid heddles right and they will treat you right. Friends, I really hope you enjoyed this video today and that it was helpful to you. Hopefully some of you have had a little bit of a light bulb moment during this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this video with anyone you think might benefit from it. As always, leave your questions and comments down below, and until next time, happy weaving!